Long before large cats and wolves dominated the land, South America belonged to a very different kind of hunter. It did not crawl low to the ground or hide in tall grass. It did not stalk silently through trees or wait in the dark. It stood tall, moved in the open, and killed in full view of the landscape. These predators were known today as furushrasids, but they are far better remembered by the name that describes them perfectly: terror birds. For millions of years, these massive flightless birds were at the very top of the food chain in South America. Some species stood over 10 feet tall, with long, powerful legs built for speed and balance. Their bodies were heavy and muscular, yet perfectly designed for rapid movement over open land. Instead of wings suited for flight, they had strong, reduced limbs used for balance while running, turning them into living, breathing pursuit predators. At the end of a long neck sat their most devastating feature, a massive, hooked beak. Thick, curved, and sharp at the point, it was shaped not for tearing flesh slowly, but for delivering rapid, crushing strikes. It acted more like an axe or a hammer than a typical bird's beak. With a single powerful downward hit, a skull could be cracked open. Smaller prey could be killed almost instantly. Larger animals would collapse from trauma before they ever had a chance to escape. South America, at this time, was a continent of strange mammals. Armored creatures resembling living tanks walked the plains. Giant sloth-like animals moved slowly across the land. Early hoofed mammals ran in herds, while smaller creatures hid in vegetation. There were no big cats from the north. No wolves. No bears. Those competitors simply did not exist on this isolated continent yet. That isolation created the perfect opportunity for terror birds to evolve into apex predators. With no rival large carnivorous mammals to challenge them, these birds expanded into nearly every predator role available. Different species of furushrasid evolved to fill different niches. Some became extremely large, nearly as tall as giraffe shoulders. Others were slightly smaller but faster, built for rapid pursuit. Some lived in open grasslands. Others dominated forest edges and river regions. Together, they controlled the ecosystem in a way that no bird ever had before or since. Built for speed and endurance, they could run faster than the fastest mammals of their time. Long strides allowed them to close distances quickly. Once a target was selected, escape was almost impossible. The ground trembled with each step as they charged. Loose soil, dust, dry grass, everything scattered as they moved in. When they reached their target, they did not bite like mammals. They struck, over and over. The beak came down like a hammer aimed at the most vulnerable part of the body, the head and neck. Bones shattered. Nervous systems collapsed. Prey dropped. The entire attack could be over in seconds, leaving behind almost no struggle. This method of hunting shaped the evolution of other animals on the continent. Mammals adapted by becoming more armored, faster, or more cautious. Some developed thick hides or bony plates. Others stayed close to herds or dense cover. Small creatures adjusted their behavior, moving mostly at night or hiding in burrows that birds could not easily reach. The presence of terror birds didn't just influence survival. It controlled how the entire environment functioned. Evidence of these birds has been found all across South America. Fossilized leg bones, powerful hips, reinforced skulls, and the unmistakable hooked beak have been recovered in Argentina, Brazil, and other regions. These were not rare animals. They were widespread and successful for a very long time. Generations of them dominated the continent, each one perfectly designed for a world without large mammalian competitors. And yet, once again, the world they ruled was not permanent. The climate began to shift. Landscapes transformed. Forests and plains changed shape. Other animals evolved in new regions of the world, growing more efficient, more aggressive, and more adaptable. Far to the north, a new connection between continents was slowly forming. a land bridge that would eventually link South America to North America. That single connection would change everything, because on the other side of that coming bridge were creatures that had never before set foot on South American soil. Large predatory mammals armed with crushing jaws, sharp teeth, pack instincts, and new hunting strategies. A completely different kind of killer was moving closer with each passing era. And for the first time in their long reign, the terror birds were about to face real competition. As the southern landscapes continued to shift, the tension building on the horizon was invisible but unstoppable. The land itself was moving into a new phase of history. For millions of years, South America had existed in near isolation, drifting like its own closed world, allowing strange and powerful creatures to evolve without interference from the rest of the planet. Terror birds were a perfect product of that isolation. Every advantage they had, their size, speed, hunting style, and lack of natural rivals, came from living on a continent cut off from outside competition. The land connection in the north, later known as the Isthmus of Panama, was forming as tectonic forces pushed the continents together. What had once been an open sea separating North and South America began to fill with rising land. At first, it appeared as chains of small islands. Then, narrow strips of solid ground started emerging above the waterline. Over an unimaginable span of time, this became a continuous natural bridge between two very different worlds. On one side stood the South American ecosystem, ruled by terror birds, giant sloths, armored glyptodonts, and massive herbivores shaped by a predator system that relied on speed and beaks instead of teeth and claws. On the other side stood North America, home to increasingly advanced carnivorous mammals, saber-toothed cats, large canines, and massive bear-like hunters. These predators had evolved around different prey, different terrain, and different combat methods. When this bridge came into full existence, life began to move in both directions. This moment in Earth's history is known as the Great American Biotic Interchange, and it was one of the most important animal migrations ever to take place. Species poured across this new path. Some South American animals migrated north. But far more impactful was what came south: large, efficient mammalian predators entering an environment that had never faced anything like them before. For the first time, terror birds were no longer the only apex hunters of the land. The arrival of these predators didn't cause immediate chaos. No single battle marked the beginning of the end. Instead, it started as competition. New hunters and old rulers began targeting the same prey. Territories overlapped. Hunting grounds shrank. The rules of dominance that had governed South America for millions of years began to break down. A terror bird was still incredibly dangerous. Its speed remained an advantage. Its height allowed it to spot prey across massive open distances. Its beak could still crush skulls, but it was now facing animals that attacked differently. Animals that could grab and hold. Animals with powerful jaws that locked onto limbs and throats. Animals that could hunt in coordinated groups or adapt their strategies when prey changed. For the first time, terror birds were forced into unfamiliar situations. Instead of dominating vast open plains, they had to defend specific territories. Instead of controlling the entire ecosystem through fear, they had to fight for access to food. Prey animals, which once struggled mainly against a single primary type of predator, now faced threats from multiple directions. And as the prey situation weakened, the pressure on apex predators intensified. Some species of terror birds adapted by becoming even more specialized. Larger species focused on bigger prey, but came into direct conflict with mammalian predators that were equally capable. Smaller, faster species pushed into narrower regions, using speed as their last major advantage. But these adjustments only delayed the inevitable. The environment they had mastered was now being reshaped by forces outside their evolutionary history. Another factor worked silently against them: reproduction. Large birds lay relatively few eggs compared to the number of offspring produced by mammals across many generations. When an adult predator died, it was not easily replaced. Mammals, with higher reproductive rates and more flexible survival strategies for young, slowly built their populations while terror bird numbers began to thin. Climate also continued to change. Grasslands expanded in some areas. Forests retreated in others. New plant species appeared. Seasons became more defined. The once familiar landscape transformed into something that better suited four-legged hunters that operated at ground level rather than towering. Predators designed for open sight lines and rapid straight-line pursuit. Over time, the presence of terror birds became less common. Fossil layers that once showed their bones frequently now began to show them only occasionally. Their footprints no longer marked the same wide regions. The echo of their dominance faded quietly into the background of geological time. And yet, even in decline, they remained a defining force of the land for a long period. Their size, their bone structure, their unmistakable skulls continued to appear in the fossil record like signatures from a vanished age. Each discovery showed just how specialized and perfectly adapted they had been, and how quickly the world had changed around them. The terror birds did not fall because they were weak. They fell because the world that had shaped them stopped existing. Nature does not favor loyalty. It does not preserve power out of nostalgia. It rewards adaptability. When conditions shift, dominance must shift too. And in South America, the balance of power moved from towering, beaked runners to faster reproducing, more versatile mammalian predators. Still, for millions of years before that change, terror birds were unmatched. They hunted creatures that other animals would not dare challenge. They shaped the very behavior of entire ecosystems. Smaller animals lived under their shadow. Larger animals grew armor because of them. Movement patterns, herd structure, migration routes, even the shape of the land's living network was built around avoiding or surviving these towering predators. Their extinction did not erase their impact. The bones, the imprints, the layers of rock and sediment all carried their memory forward in silence. And beneath the modern ground of South America, long after the last terror bird took its final step, the earth still holds outlines of their world, frozen in time, waiting to be uncovered again. As the great exchange of animals continued and new predators spread deeper into South America, the land itself began to feel crowded in a way it never had before. Not crowded with numbers, but crowded with competition. Where once the terror birds could scan wide, open stretches of land and see no equal, the horizon now slowly filled with new shapes, new movements, new threats that operated on entirely different rules. Mammalian predators brought something the terror birds had never truly faced: persistence. They didn't rely only on speed in short bursts. They could follow trails, track movement, return to the same hunting grounds repeatedly, and adjust their tactics based on experience. Some worked alone. Others gradually developed loose group behaviors. They tested the ecosystem and figured out how to exploit it. This forced the remaining terror birds into constant motion. Territories that had once been secure became unstable. A hunting ground that provided food for generations could suddenly be invaded, made dangerous, stripped of prey. Individuals began to roam farther in search of safer, richer areas. But movement meant risk. The more ground they covered, the more likely it became that they would encounter unfamiliar predators, fight for resources, or move into landscapes that no longer supported their hunting style. Their huge size, once a perfect advantage, became harder to sustain. A body that large requires enormous energy. Without reliable access to large prey, maintaining that mass became a disadvantage instead of a blessing. Prey animals were now being hunted from above and below, by beak and by tooth, and many populations began to decline or shift their ranges. Some species migrated, others dwindled. Entire food sources became unpredictable. The terror bird, as greatest strength, specialized dominance, became its greatest weakness in a world that no longer revolved around a single ruler. As the strongest species declined, smaller and more adaptable birds held out longer. These weren't nearly as tall, but they were faster, more flexible in where they can live, and able to survive on a wider variety of prey. They moved along forest edges, riverbanks, and broken plains, feeding on smaller animals and scavenging when necessary. But even these adaptable species struggled as mammalian predators continued to spread into every corner of the landscape. The ecosystem itself moved into a new phase. Vegetation patterns changed again. Grasslands expanded across some regions. Denser forests grew in others. The open and closed landscape created new travel corridors for mammals, paths that gave them more advantages while interrupting the long, straight pursuit style that terror birds relied on. Obstacles increased. Uneven ground, denser undergrowth, hills, and shifts in terrain reduced the effectiveness of a large, forward-charging predator. Where terror birds once dominated visibility, the new landscape reduced it. This meant fewer successful hunts, more wasted energy, more dangerous encounters with other predators. An aging giant that cannot secure consistent food does not rule for long. Generations passed. The largest species of terror bird vanished first. Those towering over 10 feet were gone. Only smaller relatives remained, haunting certain pockets of the continent like fading echoes of a former age. Their world had shrunk. Their numbers had dropped. Their power, once absolute, was now limited and localized. But even in decline, the terror birds left a heavy mark on the land. The animals that survived alongside them carried traces of that long pressure. Stronger armor, faster limbs, sharper awareness, deeper instincts of caution, all shaped by millions of years under the shadow of a towering beak. Even as new mammalian predators took control, those behavioral adaptations remained burned into the DNA of surviving species. And while these changes swept the plains and forests, sediments quietly collected beneath the surface. Wind and water buried footprints, bones, collapsed eggs, fallen feathers, and entire hunting sites beneath layers of earth. Over time, stone replaced what had once been soft ground. The history of the terror birds was locked underground, preserved without witnesses. Much later, long after the continent had forgotten its past rulers, those buried layers would be exposed once again by shifting earth and erosion. Massive leg bones would appear in cliff faces. Skull fragments would emerge from dried riverbeds. Scientists would reconstruct their bodies, measure their fossils, and slowly realize the scale of what had once walked there. A bird standing taller than most people. A beak shaped like a weapon. Legs built for pursuit. A design more predatory than many mammals. The fossils told a clear story. These were not just strange creatures. They were once at the top of an entire continent's hierarchy. They shaped ecosystems, controlled prey populations, and held dominance for millions of years. Few species on Earth can claim a reign that long. And yet, like all rulers in nature, their power depended on very specific conditions. Once those conditions changed, once new predators arrived, once climates shifted, once landscapes broke apart, even the most terrifying form could not maintain its throne. Their disappearance wasn't dramatic. It wasn't one final moment of realization. It was simply a gradual quiet, one less track in the mud, one less shadow crossing the plains, one less generation born, until eventually the land went on without them, and no living creature remembered the time when tall, feathered giants once dominated the continent. Only the earth remembered. And in its stone and fossil layers, the story stayed buried, silent, and intact, waiting for those traces to be found and for the lost rulers of South America to be remembered once more. As the last populations faded, the land quietly adjusted to their absence. Spaces that had once echoed with heavy footsteps and sharp, downward strikes began to fill with different rhythms. Mammalian predators fully claimed the open plains, forests, and river edges. The food chain reorganized itself around teeth and claws instead of beaks and speed. Herds shifted their behavior again, no longer shaped by the looming silhouette of a towering bird scanning the horizon. What remained of the terror birds wasn't seen in living form, but in the shape of the land and the animals that inherited it. Their reign had carved deep patterns into the ecosystem. For millions of years, they had controlled where herds traveled, where smaller creatures hid, and how fast or cautious everything had to be to survive. Even after they vanished, those survival patterns echoed forward in new species that would never see one in life. The ground they once ran across hardened and changed, sealing away fragments of bone, claw marks, and broken shells beneath layers of sediment. Those remains slept within the earth long after the ecosystems above transformed again and again. Forests rose and fell. Rivers shifted their paths. New species appeared. Others vanished. The world moved forward, unaware of the giants that had once sprinted across its surface. And yet, in quiet places beneath ancient soil, the evidence stayed perfectly still. A curved beak turned to stone, a leg bone thicker than most modern animals, a footprint pressed into hardened mud. All of it preserved, not as myth, not as legend, but as proof that, in one distant age, birds ruled a continent and nothing on that land was safe from them. They were not just predators. They were an era. Then the era ended, and the land chose new rulers,